December 10th, 1936. Fort Belvedere, an English country house an hour west of London. King Edward VIII is sitting at a desk in his private study. He's 42 years old. He's been on the throne for 325 days, and he's about to become the only British monarch in 1,000 years to voluntarily walk away from the crown. In front of him is a single piece of paper, the instrument of abdication. He signs it. The next day, he gets on the BBC to make the most famous quitting speech in British history.
That I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility.
The woman is Wallis Simpson. She's a 40-year-old American from Baltimore. She's been married twice, and she's in the middle of divorcing her second husband. Edward's Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, has told him directly, Mary Wallis and the entire British government resigns. The church won't bless it. The Dominions won't accept it. The opposition parties won't form a replacement government. Edward can have the woman or the throne. He can't have both. So he signs. His brother Bertie becomes George VI. 3 years later, George declares war on Germany in a stammering radio broadcast that becomes the basis of the King's Speech. His daughter Elizabeth grows up to become the longest reigning monarch in British history. The entire House of Windsor, as you know it, exists because of what Edward signed in Berkshire in 1936. But what if he doesn't sign? What if Edward keeps the woman, keeps the crown, and dares the British government to do something about it? Let's hit Control-Z and rewrite history. I'm Kevin Perez-Allen, and this is Control-Z Rewritten, the podcast where we take the biggest decisions in history and ask what happens if they go the other way. Not luck, not fate, and not what-ifs pulled out of thin air. Real people, real choices, and real alternatives that were actually on the table. One decision where we hit Control-Z, try it the other way, and see how history changes. To understand what would have happened if Edward had stayed, you have to understand what kind of king he already was. Because by December of 1936, he'd been doing the job for less than a year, and he had already managed to alienate every institution in the British government. Start with the cruise. In the summer of 1936, Edward took Wallis Simpson on a 4-month vacation through the eastern Mediterranean on a steam yacht called the Nalin. They went to Yugoslavia, Greece, Turkey, and a string of Adriatic islands. Edward wore shorts. Wallis wore a swimsuit. They held hands in public. They were photographed by every American and continental European newspaper from August to October. The British press, by a gentleman's agreement with the government, didn't print a single word about it, which means British subjects were the only people on earth who didn't know their king was on a barely clothed sex vacation with a married American. Then, in November, Edward toured the depressed mining villages of South Wales. The unemployment was catastrophic. Whole towns had nothing. Edward, looking at one of the abandoned mines, said the line that would follow him for the rest of his life. Something must be done. It was a perfectly reasonable thing for any human being to say, but it was a constitutionally explosive thing for a king to say, because British monarchs are not supposed to direct policy. Stanley Baldwin's cabinet read it as Edward telling the elected government how to do its job. They were already nervous about him, and this made it worse. What further compounded that nervousness was what was happening with the red boxes. Every day, the British government sends the monarch a leather box full of confidential state papers, cabinet minutes, foreign office cables, intelligence reports, the works. The monarch reads them and signs off on what needs signing off on. Edward stopped reading them. Worse, he started leaving them lying around at Fort Belvedere, where Wallis and her house guests could pick them up over breakfast next to the marmalade. The Foreign Office got so worried about leaks that Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, personally ordered classified material screened before it went to the king. The British government had quietly decided that its own monarch was a national security risk. That was the man Stanley Baldwin was dealing with in November of 1936. A king who skipped his paperwork, leaked classified material to his American mistress's friends, told the government how to run the economy, and had just spent the summer in his swim trunks on a yacht where every photograph was a tabloid headline outside of Britain. The crisis broke in 3 weeks. On November 13th, Edward's private secretary, Alec Hardinge, wrote him a letter warning that the British press silence was about to collapse and that the public reaction would be, in his exact word, calamitous. 3 days later, Edward summoned Prime Minister Baldwin to Buckingham Palace and told him point blank that he was going to marry Wallis Simpson. Baldwin told him point blank that the public would never accept her as queen. Then Baldwin did something clever. He laid out 3 options. Option 1, give up the marriage. Option 2, marry Wallis morganatically, so she becomes his wife, but not the queen, and any kids they have don't inherit anything. Or option 3, abdicate. He sent the morganatic option to all 5 Dominion prime ministers because under the Statute of Westminster of 1931, a change to the royal succession needed Dominion approval. Australia's Joseph Lyons said no. Canada's Mackenzie King said no. South Africa's JBM Hertzog said no. New Zealand's Michael Joseph Savage was open to it. And Ireland's Eamon de Valera was open to it, but only because he saw an opportunity to use the constitutional chaos to carve references to the crown out of Ireland's own constitution, which he actually then did on December 11th while everybody was distracted. That means both options 1 and 2 were dead on arrival. On December 1st, the Bishop of Bradford gave a speech that was interpreted as a pointed criticism of the king. The British press, which had been holding its breath for months, finally exhaled. By December 3rd, the story was on every front page in the country. And on December 4th, Edward asked Baldwin if he could go on the BBC and explain himself directly to the public. Baldwin said no, told him it would be a grave breach of constitutional principle for the monarch to appeal to the people over the head of his own government. And just to make sure Edward got the message, he personally ordered the cancellation of the airplane Edward had booked to fly the speech tape to the BBC. The next day, Edward told Baldwin he would abdicate, and 5 days later, on December 10th, he signed the paper. Now that's the real timeline, but let's explore the alternate because that was a very real possibility. Also, that's the whole point of this show. So Edward doesn't sign. He doesn't ask Baldwin's permission to give the radio speech. He goes on the air the night of December 4th, 1936, and tells the British public in his own voice that his prime minister is trying to force him off the throne for marrying the woman he loves. The speech lands like a bomb. 2 of the biggest newspaper barons in Britain, Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Rothermere, who together own the 3 biggest tabloids in the country, so the Daily Express, the Evening Standard, and the Daily Mail, throw their full weight behind the king. By the morning of December 5th, 8.5 million British newspaper readers wake up to a king who has gone over his prime minister's head, and 3 million of them are reading editorials demanding that Baldwin resign. So Baldwin resigns on December 7th. The leader of the opposition Labour Party, a quiet wartime major named Clement Attlee, is summoned to Buckingham Palace and refuses to form a government. The leader of the third party, the Liberals, a Scottish aristocrat named Archibald Sinclair, refuses too. The country is now a constitutional monarchy with a king and no government, which is a thing that hasn't happened in Britain since the 17th century. And the last time it happened, Oliver Cromwell ended up running the country as a military dictator, so nobody is excited. Edward dissolves Parliament and calls a general election for March of 1937. The election is fought on one question, which is whether the King of England can marry an American divorcée. The King's party is a weird alliance. The Beaverbrook newspapers driving the propaganda, a far-right movement called the British Union of Fascists, led by a former Labour MP named Oswald Mosley, making a lot of noise on the margins, a 62-year-old backbench Conservative MP named Winston Churchill, providing intellectual cover, and a bunch of working-class voters who genuinely just like Edward. The party takes enough seats to install a new Conservative leadership willing to pass a marriage bill that allows the king to marry Wallis. The wedding happens on June 3, 1937, in a civil ceremony at Westminster. The coronation that was scheduled for May 12th gets pushed to October. Britain has spent 10 months in a constitutional crisis instead of building Spitfires. Hitler, meanwhile, has been watching all of this from Berlin, and he's been taking notes. The brother who became George VI was the wrong guy for the job. He had a severe stammer that had haunted him since childhood. He'd been raised for the Navy and not the throne, and he was the second son, which is a polite British way of saying nobody had ever taken him seriously as a future king. What he had going for him was a wife named Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who was tougher than anyone in the room, and an Australian speech therapist named Lionel Logue. Bertie started seeing Logue in October of 1926, 10 years before he became king. He taught Bertie to breathe from the diaphragm, to slow his words down, and to substitute sounds he could say for sounds he couldn't. None of it cured the stammer, but it helped him manage it. All of that work paid off on September 3rd, 1939. Bertie, now George VI, sat at a microphone in Buckingham Palace with Logue in the room and declared war on Nazi Germany on behalf of the British Empire. If you've seen the 2010 Best Picture winner The King's Speech with Colin Firth as Bertie and Geoffrey Rush as Logue, that broadcast is the climax of the film. But none of it happens if Edward doesn't sign the paper to abdicate. A year later, the Luftwaffe found Buckingham Palace. A German bomber dropped 5 high-explosive bombs on the building while Bertie and Elizabeth were inside drinking tea. A palace worker actually died. The king and queen were unhurt, and Elizabeth, photographed the next day standing in the rubble, said the line that became the most quoted sentence of British wartime morale. "I'm glad we have been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The palace was hit 9 times during the war. Bertie and Elizabeth never left London. They walked through the bombed-out East End the day after raids, talking to people who had lost their houses. The stammering second son became the human face of British resistance for 6 years. Their daughter Elizabeth was 10 when her uncle abdicated. At 14, she went on the BBC's Children's Hour and told evacuated kids across the empire that British children were going to be brave. At 19, she became the only woman in the royal family to ever serve in uniform. On February 6, 1952, she was on tour in Kenya watching elephants from a treehouse hotel when her father, King George VI, died at 56 years old. She flew home as queen and reigned for nearly 71 years, longer than any monarch in British history. But in the Control-Z timeline, none of it happens. Bertie stays the Duke of York. The heavy smoking that killed him as a king kills him in 1952 anyway. Elizabeth marries Prince Philip and lives a private life on a country estate, breeding horses the way her cousins do. Princess Margaret never has to be a princess in the spotlight, which probably saves her life. Lionel Logue dies in obscurity in 1953. On September 13, 1940, when the Luftwaffe comes for Buckingham Palace, the man inside isn't a stammering second son refusing to leave London. The man inside is Edward. And whether the bomber even goes is a question I want to come back to in our next section. In May of 1939, 4 months before the German invasion of Poland, a former King of England sat down at his home in France and recorded a radio broadcast urging the British public to come to terms with Adolf Hitler. He sent the tape to the BBC. They refused to air it and filed it away with a card that read in capital letters, "Important, not to be broadcast." It sat there for decades. The voice on that tape is Edward. His politics were never a secret. The Conservative MP Henry Chips Channon wrote in his diary in 1936 that the new king is going the dictator way and is pro-German. MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence agency, opened a file on Wallis Simpson that same year, alleging she was sleeping with Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador to London who would later become Hitler's foreign minister. The affair was never proven, but the leaks were. Classified British material was reaching Berlin through the royal household, and that's why Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden had screened Edward's red boxes. Edward's German loyalties weren't an affectation. The royal family he was born into used to be called Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. His father, George V, changed the family name to Windsor in 1917 because being German was bad PR during World War I. Edward grew up speaking the language at home and studied under a German tutor named Hermann Fiedler at Magdalen College in Oxford. In October of 1937, 10 months after he abdicated, Edward took Wallis on a tour of Nazi Germany. They were officially hosted by Robert Ley, the head of the German Labor Front. They had dinner with Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Göring. They had tea with Adolf Hitler at his mountain retreat in Bavaria. Edward inspected German troops and gave Nazi salutes on camera. Afterward, he wrote Hitler a thank you letter in German. A year later, when Hitler was preparing to invade Czechoslovakia, Edward offered to mediate personally between London and Berlin. The British government politely told him to stay out of it. That was Edward in real history, a former king in a French country house still trying to push Britain towards peace with Hitler. In the CTRL+Z timeline, there is a very big problem. He's still the king. The October 1937 tour of Germany happens as a state visit. Edward stands next to Hitler on a balcony at the Berghof while a German military band plays God Save the King. The photographs are state documents. The Nazi salutes are official acts of the British crown. In September of 1938, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flies to Munich to sign over a third of Czechoslovakia to Germany. He flies with the open public endorsement of his king. Winston Churchill, who 2 years earlier had helped Edward keep the throne, expecting an ally against Hitler, watches the king endorse the Sudeten deal and realizes he backed the wrong man. Churchill breaks with Edward publicly. The break makes him a known enemy of the monarch, which makes him politically radioactive. The British appeasement movement has the head of state on its side. On March 31st, 1939, Chamberlain stood up in the House of Commons and promised Britain would defend Polish independence. He made the promise reluctantly, and he spent the summer of 1939 hoping he wouldn't have to honor it. His Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, was even more reluctant. Halifax wanted to keep negotiating with Hitler even after Britain declared war in real history. The cabinet was split. Some members saw the Polish guarantee as a moral obligation. Others saw it as a blunder that needed to be quietly walked back. In the CTRL+Z timeline, the swing vote in that argument is the king. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. Edward summons Chamberlain to Buckingham Palace and tells him exactly what he told the British public on the BBC tape in May. Britain has no business going to war over a country in Eastern Europe that most of its voters couldn't find on a map. The Polish guarantee was a mistake, and walking it back is the responsible thing to do. The king will not endorse a war declaration. Chamberlain did what he was known for. He folds. Halifax wins the cabinet argument. On the morning of September 3rd, instead of declaring war, the British government issues a diplomatic note expressing, quote, grave concern about events in Poland and calling for international mediation. Hitler ignores it. France was always going to follow Britain's lead. The French general staff didn't believe they could beat Germany alone. Prime Minister Edward Daladier had personally signed the Munich Agreement in 1938 for that reason. Even in real history, the French declaration of war on September 3rd came hours after Britain, because Paris was waiting to see what London would do. With Britain out, France stays out. Poland falls in 3 weeks. The Soviet Union takes its half on September 17th, per the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which Stalin and Hitler had signed on August 23rd to carve up Eastern Europe between them. World War II, as we know it, doesn't begin in September of 1939. Without a British war, a lot of British history doesn't happen. The British Expeditionary Force that landed in France in real history and barely escaped through Dunkirk in June 1940 never gets there. There's no war to ship them to. The German bombing of London that lasted 9 months and killed more than 40,000 civilians never happens because the Luftwaffe has no British targets to bomb. Buckingham Palace stands undamaged. The East End of London goes to bed every night without sirens. Children aren't evacuated to the countryside. Meat isn't rationed. The British public, who in real history endured 14 years of food rationing that didn't end until 1954, eat normally through the entire decade. Now that's the surface. Underneath, the rest of the world is on fire. Hitler still wants to invade the Soviet Union. The whole ideological core of Nazism is something called Lebensraum, which translates to living space. It's the belief that the German people need to expand east into Slavic territory and either kill or enslave everyone currently living there. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the USSR, launches on June 22, 1941, on schedule. Hitler's plans for USSR had nothing to do with Britain. What changes is the size of the army that crosses the border. In real history, 3 million German soldiers invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. The number was capped by everything Germany was doing in the West. Hundreds of thousands of troops were tied up garrisoning occupied France, fighting in North Africa, supplying the U-boat war in the Atlantic, or some of them were just defending German cities from British bombers. In our Control-Z timeline, none of that exists. The full strength of the Wehrmacht goes east. 5 million soldiers crossed the Soviet border in June 1941. The largest invasion force in human history just got roughly 50% bigger. The Soviets fight that army alone. In real history, the United States Congress passed something called the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941. It was a program that let President Franklin Roosevelt funnel American military equipment to America's allies. Britain got most of it at first, and then after Germany invaded the USSR, Stalin started getting it too. By 1945, Lend-Lease had moved $50 billion of American material to the Allied war effort, $11 billion of it to the Soviets. So that was 427,000 trucks, 11,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of food. Roosevelt could only get the program through Congress because Britain was already at war and visibly desperate. Without that war, Lend-Lease never passes. So the Soviets get nothing from America. Stalin's Red Army gets the war he prepared for in 1937. The preparation involved purging his own military, executing most of his senior generals, and gutting his officer corps just before the largest army in human history showed up at the border. In real history, even with American supplies, the Soviet defense barely held. Without supplies against an army about 50% larger, it doesn't hold. Moscow falls that winter, and then Leningrad. By 1943, the Soviet Union as an organized state has ceased to exist. Stalin escapes east of the Urals to lead a hopeless guerrilla resistance through the Siberian forests, but he dies in 1947 of a stroke in a wooden cabin nobody can find. Pearl Harbor still happens on December 7, 1941. The attack had nothing to do with Europe. It was driven by an American oil embargo and Japanese ambitions in East Asia, both on their own track. The United States enters the Pacific War with no Atlantic War to enter alongside it. No Churchill to coordinate strategy with, no European front to send troops to. America fights Japan alone and wins eventually, while watching Germany consolidate the European continent with no way to interfere. The British Commonwealth doesn't show up either. In real history, Australia, Canada, and South Africa declared war on Germany within a week of Britain. Without a British declaration, none of them have a trigger. Australia's Prime Minister Robert Menzies, who in real history broadcast his country's entry into the war and then a week later privately wrote that Britain should be looking for peace negotiations with Hitler, stays neutral. Canada's Prime Minister Mackenzie King keeps his country out and gets reelected for it. South Africa, under Prime Minister JBM Hertzog, stays neutral too. The cabinet vote that toppled Hertzog in real history over whether to join the war never even comes up. The 5 million Commonwealth and Empire troops who served against Germany in real history never mobilize. I want to pause here because nothing I've said so far is the darkest part of this timeline. And there is an extremely dark part of this timeline. In Eastern Europe, the Holocaust runs to completion. In real history, the Nazi regime murdered 6 million Jews between 1941 and 1945. That number isn't a target, it's how far the killing machine got before Allied armies arriving from the East and the West physically shut it down. There were 9.5 million Jews living in Europe when the war started in 1939. By the time the Soviets reached Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, the Nazis had murdered approximately 2/3 of them. They were on track to murder the rest. In the Control-Z timeline, nobody arrives. The Soviet army that liberated Auschwitz never reaches the camp because the Soviet army no longer exists. The American and British armies that liberated Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen and Dachau in April of 1945 never crossed into Europe. American bombers never strike the rail lines that fed the killing centers. The trains keep running. The killing machine that processed Jewish, Roma, Polish, and Soviet civilians at industrial capacity in 1942 stays operational into the late 40s until there is no European Jewish population left to murder. 6 million becomes 9.5 million and only ceases because there's no one left. The killing doesn't stop there. The Nazi plan for Eastern Europe was never just the murder of the Jewish population. It was something called General Plan Ost, the general plan for the East approved by Hitler in May of 1942. It called for the depopulation of Slavic Eastern Europe through mass killing, deliberate starvation, and forced deportation beyond the Ural Mountains to clear territory for German colonists. The projected death toll was approximately 31 million Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Czechs, and Balts, carried out over 25 years. In real history, General Plan Ost was only partially implemented before Germany lost the war. In the Control-Z timeline, the Nazi regime gets to find out what that full number actually is. There's no Nuremberg tribunal in 1946 to prosecute the surviving Nazi leadership because there's no Allied victory to hold a tribunal after. The systematic destruction of Holocaust evidence that the Nazis carried out in real history during the closing months of the war never has to happen because there are no closing months of the war. The history of what happened in Eastern Europe between 1942 and the late 1950s is whatever the German government 20 years later chooses to tell its grandchildren about it. Britain spends those years as a friendly neutral to Berlin. The Royal Navy still rules the seas. The British Empire is technically still standing. India still wants independence and Egypt still wants the British out, but nobody has the strength to push the issue while Germany controls Europe. The United Kingdom itself is undamaged. The cities are unbombed, and Britons go about their business in a country that hasn't lost a son to a war on the continent. Edward, the king who kept his throne, sits at the center of the most successful appeasement campaign in modern European history, and most of his subjects love him for it. He's the king who kept Britain out of the war, who saved a generation of young men from dying in Belgium and France for reasons nobody could explain to them, who proved you could deal with Hitler if you just gave him what he wanted. The Britons who don't read foreign newspapers or listen to BBC reports about what's happening across the channel look at the continent and shrug. That's a German problem now. The Britons who do read the foreign reports, however, know what Edward's silence is buying. Some of them say so out loud. Most of them don't. The ones who do are told they're being hysterical, that the rumors are exaggerated, and that the British government has investigated and is satisfied that Edward and Wallis would never tolerate such a thing. This goes on for a long time. Edward never wanted to be king. He told his family in the 1920s that he found the job exhausting. By 1935, he was telling his staff he dreaded his father's death because of what it would mean for him. The man who almost broke the British monarchy to marry an American divorcée was, by his own private admission to people who knew him best, looking for a way out from the moment he realized the throne was coming. He found one. What saved Britain in 1939 had nothing to do with constitutional safeguards or institutional foresight. The bad king happened to want something else more than he wanted the throne, and in chasing it, he gave the job to someone better. Edward fought hard for Wallis Simpson, lost, and in losing, handed the throne to a brother nobody had ever expected to do the job, but who turned out to be the man Britain needed 3 years later. That's not how history is supposed to work. Britain got the king it needed for 1939 because the man on the throne in 1936 fell in love with an American. In the Control-Z timeline, Edward wins. He marries Wallis, he keeps the crown, and he keeps Britain out of a war he never believed in. But the bill comes due everywhere else. In Warsaw, in Leningrad, in Auschwitz, in every Ukrainian village where the hunger plan runs its course. Edward gets what he wants, but the world pays the bill. That's the world where the man got what he wanted. Thankfully, we got the one where he didn't. Decisions don't get do-overs, but on this show they do. If you like the show, please rate and subscribe wherever you happen to be listening. It helps other people find the show and allows me to understand whether people actually enjoy it. Until next time, I'm Kevin Perez Allen. Thanks for hitting Control-Z with me.